Our next guest is a legend in journalism. He has served as Washington bureau chief for CNBC and the Wall Street Journal, where he later became deputy managing director and executive editor online. He went on to become president of Pew Research, then editor of Fortune magazine. Since 2018, he has served as chief executive officer of Fortune Media. Please welcome to the stage Mr. Alan Murray and John Hope Bryant.
I don't know how you have the energy to do this, just one after the other. You're awesome.
Well, when you care, it's easy. And everybody I bring on this stage, I try to apply the passion version of the Oprah rule. When Oprah gave me an award, her producers and her support people said that they had to do the Oprah test on me, which was they had to go and do deep background on me, going back to my childhood, to make sure that I had as much to lose reputationally as she did.
Wow.
I've never said
and you passed.
Well, I guess. And that $100,000 that she gave me to start my office in Chicago, thank you, Oprah Winfrey, and with money from Paul Newman, it was his salad dressing company, profits from that, which we're going to talk about this ethos, because he was ahead of his time. The money was important, but the credibility was more important. And when I bring people on stage, it's important that they have as much to lose as I do, that they're people I feel like I can wrap my hands around, that if they make a mistake, blame it on their head, not their heart, that they're decent, good people. And everybody makes a mistake, but they're not a mistake. They make a mistake, they're not a mistake. And you and I have this sort of relationship that's almost unarticulated. I can't say how you feel about me, but I trust you. And trust for a journalist is probably everything beyond basic competence, to be trusted.
It is.
And you've been passionate about this since you were 9 years old. And just to contextualize what this job is, I want to make sure I say this properly. Fortune magazine is, in long form sort of reading, people talk about the Fortune 500. You follow me? Fortune magazine is to business what Ebony magazine or Essence magazine was to the black community. And your role as the head of this editorially is, it brings gravitas to the conversation. So you, like me, have a lot to lose with the topics with which you wrap your arms around. Yet you come here talking about social justice, which is a bit of a risk in business. So you've been passionate about this from 9 years old. You come here today. Is the thing that drove you to journalism at 9 years old and the thing that has you here on this stage, is it the same line of passion?
I think there's a line. You're asking for my life story. Are you going to give me time for that? I mean, I'm an old man here.
Whatever you can do, whatever you can
No,
do in
look,
a minute.
I appreciate you say I started as a journalist when I was 9 years old.
Interested in journalism.
I actually walked up and down the neighborhood and asked people about they lost their cat or their grandmother was visiting, and I would take notes. And this is before the day of Xerox machines. So I would take all my notes home to my mother, and I'd lay them all out longhand, and she'd type them on a special kind of carbon paper, and I had a jelly sheet copying machine. I could make a copy of my newspaper on the jelly sheet copying machine, run off 30 copies, and sell them for a nickel a piece. I think I have no idea. 9 years old, you don't know why you're doing something, but I did feel like I was doing a service. I was providing facts to these people about their neighbors and what their neighbors were up to. And I do feel very passionately about facts and about truth, and very disturbed about what's happened to facts and truth in our society. We can put that aside for a different conversation. But I want to get back to social justice, because that was really the question you were asking. I mean, the other thing about my mother was she had a very strong sense of social justice. We moved to Tennessee when I was 9 years old, and she it was kind of a tough time for race relations. It was, busing was underway, and my earliest, strongest memory of my mother was if we would be in a room, we lived on Lookout Mountain, which Dr. King pinpointed as kind of a symbol of affluent bigotry. It was from Stone Mountain to Lookout Mountain. And she would, if we were in a room where someone, one of my father's friends, somebody said something that had a hint of racism in it, she would just stand up and walk out. She wouldn't say anything. She would just quietly get up and walk out of the room. She said, I'm not going to be witness to this. And it made, I mean, I was a kid. I didn't really know fully what was going on, but it made a real impression on me about your role in life and the need to be witness, that you can't be a passive. Even as a journalist, where my job was to be passive, at the end of the day, you can't really be passive. You have to make a stand. As far as how that's come up in the business world, though, there's been a dramatic, you had Dan Schulman out here earlier. Dan Schulman is a different breed of leader than existed when I started my career watching business journalism. And it's, you know, I've been doing this for 4 decades. It's changed dramatically over those 4 decades. In some ways, it's changed over the last 10 years. I mean, think about this, John, and then I'll let you get on to another topic. But when Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri, that's 2014, you go back and look and see if you can find a single CEO of a major company who said anything. And it's not because they didn't think it was horrible. It's like, my job is to take care of my company. This doesn't affect my bottom line. I'm not going to get involved. I'm going to keep my head down and stick to the things that directly affect my bottom line. You compare that to what happened when the George Floyd murder happened last year. You had CEOs at all the major companies speaking out. Now, you can say it's just words, it's cheap, but something profoundly has changed in the way leaders of large businesses think about their jobs and their responsibility in society.
Well, $50 billion of commitment to social justice, even if half of that's fluff, is still a lot of
It's not nothing.
work. That's not nothing.
It may not be enough, it may not be fast enough, but something, again, I'm speaking as a journalist, something very different. I have lots of theories about why, but something very different is going on today.
Why don't you tell us what your feeling is about the why?
Well, look, if you go back to when I started in this business and you think about the 20th Century Corporation, it was really it was pretty simple the way it worked. It was like an information hierarchy. You had all these people, they would send information up to the C-suite. The people in the C-suite would put together a strategy, and then they'd send orders back down. Here's what you have to do. It was very hierarchical and straightforward. That's all been blown up. First of all, information doesn't travel just vertically. It travels all over the place. Everybody gets it. And in fact, if you try and run a company by waiting for all the information to get up to the C-suite and formulating a strategy, you're going to be too late. You're going to be behind the ball. Things are moving faster. That whole model of leadership doesn't work anymore. So you have to operate at a completely different speed. But then the other thing that's changed is the importance of people. There's a guy who did a study, and he looked at the book value of Fortune 500 companies in the 1970s. And more than 80% of the book value of Fortune 500 companies was physical stuff. It was plant, equipment, oil in the ground, inventory on the shelves. If you do the same exercise today, more than 85% of the book value of Fortune 500 companies is intangibles. So what does that mean? It's like intellectual property, it's software. The value of the brand, it's software, but really if you follow that back, it's people. The value comes from people, much less from stuff. And so business leaders have been forced to become much more human. If you know, a guy like Dan Schulman, if you want to win the game, you need to attract the best people. And if you're going to attract the best people, you got to do more than just tell them what to do and write them a paycheck. You got to give them a reason. You got to give them a purpose. You got to give them a North Star. You know, I covered business for 4 decades, and it's really only in about the last 6 years that I've heard business leaders talk about moral leadership. You would think that would have always been part of the toolkit, but it wasn't. But it is today, because that's what you have to do to motivate people to achieve great value in business.
So, yeah, absolutely. So what I'm hearing this theme. Sam inferred it. Dan said it. You're underscoring it. This is very exciting stuff. You're telling me that what used to be sort of at the periphery, the human good, wellness, societal benefit, social justice, that we would call it, that these things are increasingly core.
They are the core. They are the core. And look, we live in a very cynical society, and a lot of my colleagues in the press are very cynical. And so people, when all those statements come out about George Floyd, people roll their eyes. And some of them probably were, only words and not backed up by action. But the fundamental nature of business is changing, and it's changing in a good way because these issues are at the core of.
So name a few, if you will, either individuals or companies that you think are getting it right these days. And I want to pivot to what the Business Roundtable did and
important.
how that's changed the nature of valuing what they call shareholder value. But I'll get to that in a minute. Let's talk about. Is Dan Shulman an outlier, or is he the new?
So look, I've heard this. It's really over the course of the last decade. I think it was since the Great Recession that I started hearing this more and more. And when I have the opportunity in my job to speak to a lot of CEOs, and I ask them questions. And when I hear them say the kinds of things Dan says, I push them and say, why? Why are you saying this? I would have said Dan was an outlier 10 years ago, less so today. I mean, it's probably not the majority, but it is a steadily growing group. You talk about the Business Roundtable statement. So one of the people who was instrumental in that was Ginny Rometty, who at the time was CEO at IBM. One of the things that she's done at IBM is say, we have a responsibility to train people. It gets to what Sam Altman was talking about. We have a responsibility to train people to take the jobs that are going to be created by this technological revolution.
Yes.
There will be jobs created. The challenge is, will people have the opportunity? I love what he said about talent is widely distributed, opportunity is narrowly distributed.
That's right.
Will people have the opportunity to take advantage of these jobs that are going to be created? And so,
and by the way, that's why I believe this infrastructure bill that's being debated and the human capital part of that, of retraining workers for the future, is so incredibly important.
So important. So Ginny Rometty at IBM said, well, we train people. We train the people who work for us, but we really have a broader responsibility to society than that. And so they created this P-Tech program that trained thousands of people who never went to work for IBM. But it was to address the training challenge. And then she went on, by the way, after last year, she went on to join up with the two Kens, Ken Frazier, the CEO of Merck, and the former CEO of American Express, to create the 110 Initiative, which is, again, an effort to provide 1 million jobs over the next 10 years for people, good jobs, for people who wouldn't have gotten them otherwise. So I could give you dozens of examples of that, and we talked about speaking out.
John Donahoe at Nike.
John Donahoe is an amazing, and has a personal story behind it. He kind of took a year off after he was CEO of eBay to figure out what he wanted to do with the rest of his life, and he knew that he wanted to have a strong purpose, and he believes it. And it's been good for his company, as you point out. It's been good for PayPal. Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, I think has been really instrumental in this. I mean, he was the one, as a journalist, trying to get CEOs to talk about controversial social issues over the years. It was, back to what I said, I mean, the standard view was, if it doesn't affect the bottom line of my company, I'm closing the door. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to get involved. Keep me out of it. I'm going to focus on the bottom line. Benioff changed that. Michael Brown was 2014. I think it was later that year, maybe 2015, when the state of Indiana, when Mike Pence was governor, passed a law that was widely seen as discriminating against homosexuals, gays, the whole LGBT community. And Benioff said, okay, I'm out. I got a big plant in Indiana. We're not going to be in Indiana if this is the way you're going to run your state. That was unheard of. That was unheard of. That didn't happen in business before 2015. And since then, you've had a whole string of that. State of North Carolina passes a bill about public access to bathrooms, seen as discriminating against transgender people. Bank of America, the largest employer in the state, says, nope, we're not going along with that. You got to change it. Here in the state of Georgia, after the Parkland shootings in Florida, Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta Airlines, he has a tax bill.
Brilliant.
A tax bill in front of the state legislature. The majority of the legislature's members are members of the NRA, and he says, you know what, I'm out. We're not gonna give that discount to people flying to the NRA.
And that was before George Floyd. Absolutely.
Yeah, that was
he
before.
deserves applause. Absolutely.
And you, again, that sort of thing didn't happen. Demonstrable hit to his bottom line. Said, sorry, I believe in this is the right thing to do. We're going to do it.
And by the way, before the pandemic hit, I stood with him on Squawk Box to announce he was making $2 billion of profit sharing with his employees. 3 months later, the company's in trouble because of the pandemic. The employees so believed in what he believed in, and they knew that he
stuck with him. Yeah.
backed him, that he didn't have to lay off one employee. They all took voluntary leave. That saved the company money and hassle and problems, and they backed him. And when it came out of the pandemic, he came out stronger than any of the other.
Well, that's the amazing thing. So yes, he took a hit. He took a hit. He lost the tax benefit in the state, but in the long run, it's paid off. Just as it's paid off for John Donahoe at Nike, just as it's paid off for Dan Schulman at PayPal, just as it's paid off for. Before I came down here tonight, I was reading Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. I mean, this is a company that's now worth $2.3 trillion. I didn't think we would ever see a company worth more than $2 trillion. I didn't think we'd see a company worth more than $1 trillion in my lifetime. He wrote a letter to it's what used to be called a letter to his shareholders, but it's now a letter to his shareholders, his employees, his customers, the communities they live in, the whole stakeholder. And it talks a lot about technology and the incredible things happening in technology, but then it ends with a strong statement of Microsoft's purpose. It talks about inclusive growth, it talks about sustainability, and it talks about trust.
Yeah.
That technology has to engender trust. He means that stuff, and it's serving his business interests really well, but I think it's serving the world well, too, to have companies turn in this direction. I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna here. I mean, there's still plenty of companies that do bad things. Even good companies do bad things. But something, as a journalist, I can tell you, something is very different than it was in business than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
As we begin to wrap up, Alan, where do you think all this is headed? How does this relate to the Business Roundtable and their redefinition of shareholder value? And if we have time, I want to tell the story about Robert Woodruff, but we may not have time. We're short on time, but I don't want to shortchange your close. You go first. How does all this relate to what the Business Roundtable, the gauntlet they put down, I think 2 years ago, and where are we going?
Well, here's the thing. We spent a century, maybe 2 centuries, developing this financial architecture that measures shareholder returns. I mean, you got the big 4 accounting firms, you got all kinds. Everybody knows how to do that. We got that down now. We've been working on it for 200 years.
Yeah.
We're just beginning to figure out how you make these stakeholder commitments real and measurable and tangible and accountable. Because if you can't measure them, you can't hold companies account for what they say. And so they could say one thing and do something else. So I think it's going to take a while to develop that infrastructure to make the Business Roundtable's statement become a practical reality. I do believe we're headed in that direction. I think the big issue, if you want to know what keeps me up at night, the big issue is, are we moving fast enough to deal with the pace of change and the challenge? I mean, technology, no question in my mind, has exacerbated the divisions in our society. Pandemic, no question in my mind, exacerbated the divisions in our society. So it's great to see business moving in a direction to heal those divisions, but the question is, can the business community move faster than the divisions are growing?
You know what I like about you, man? I don't know if you guys are noticing this. Have you noticed that he doesn't edit when he talks? He just talks. He believes something, and you say it. He says it, and you hear it. It's wonderful to talk to somebody who actually lives their values.
Oh, well, thank you.
So thank you for that. I'm out of time, but I'm gonna do this anyway, because I think it's important to sort of put a cherry on this cake. I thought a few years ago there were very few what I call Woodruff-era leaders. Robert Woodruff, the example here. You probably know the story. Ambassador Young is here. He knows it better than me, but when Dr. King and Ambassador Young were coming back from Norway, he had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Let me tell the story real quickly. And the problem in Atlanta was supposedly the moral capital of America back then, and I think it is now. The business community here didn't want to honor him for winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And the mayor didn't have the power in and of themselves to force them to do it, so he went to the CEO of Coca-Cola. At that point, he was the just retired CEO, Robert Woodruff. We have a problem. Robert Woodruff said, this is ridiculous. Get all the business leaders in my office. I'm giving you the short version of the story. They get in his office and they say, look, knock it off. You don't like this guy? Of course you don't like this guy. He's creating change. You call him a troublemaker? No, that's called a transformer. And he's causing you to think about things you don't want to think about. That doesn't mean he's wrong. It means he's ahead of his time. But let me make this very clear to you, he said. This man won the most important award in the world. Pause. We're the largest then global supply company in the world, Coca-Cola. Pause. If you don't want to honor this man, we're going to move out of this little backwards rear-end city. Because clearly you don't get where the world's going. You need us more than we need you. By the way, most of you in here, business leaders, are my vendors, which means I'm writing your check.
Yeah.
I want you to sell out that ballroom within 2 weeks. You have a day to make the decision. And he walked out the room, dropped the mic. If you go and look on your phones on the Nobel Peace Prize honor for Dr. King in Atlanta, the ballroom was packed and folks were lining the walls. It wasn't just that in 1960 whatever people had great moral fiber. It's that business leaders who may not have gotten the credit then, Robert Woodruff, stood up and said, knock it off, do the right thing. And just so happens, by the way, after that, blacks and others here and in Africa fueled Coca-Cola's growth for decades.
Yeah, and let me say to that really quickly, because it's a great story. It's a great story. And you know, if you read Peter Drucker or the best business leaders have always led with a clear sense of purpose. So I don't want to pretend that something brand new has happened, but we did have kind of an era at the end of the century where there was just way too much focus on short-term shareholder return.
Yep.
And I do think the dynamics of business are changing in a way that now it's not just the best. It's sort of anybody who wants to be successful needs to pay attention to these human factors because it's the core of value.
Welcome to an era, hopefully, like Doug McMillan of Walmart and
great example.
Ed Bastian of Delta, and in this room here, Janice Bryant Howroy, the second largest black business in America, $3 billion in revenue, who believes that
you got Josh Silverman coming.
Josh is coming of Etsy. Folks who believe you can do well and do good too. Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank
say
you.
thank you to Alan.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.